Hello YouTube, my name is Zach, and today I'm going to be analyzing The Sound of Silence as covered by Disturbed on Conan O'Brien. Just kidding, that is the most auto-tuned pile of garbage I've ever heard in my life, and that's all I will ever have to say about that, unlike most of these vocal coach react videos these days who are just riding the wave of that video for whatever reason. In all seriousness, I'm going to be analyzing Floor Jansen of Nightwish. This is Sleeping Sun. Now, I know I've already heard about the rivalry that you all have built between the two singers, Tarja and Floor. I know that there's a big rivalry, who's better than the other. I don't have a stone to throw in that debate. I'm just giving you an analysis. I will tell you up front so that you're not disappointed that I believe that Tarja has much better singing technique than Floor, but I think Floor's voice fits the music better. So there you go. I'm hedging my bets. You guys can take that as you will and run with it. I'm not going to sit here and get into a debate of who I think is a better overall singer, because that's a ridiculous argument to get into anyway, because everyone uses their voices in their own respective ways. And me trying to say that because Tarja is more classically trained, she's the better singer is ridiculous, because I don't think that the sound of her voice fits as well in Nightwish's music as Floor's does, even though she's not as technically sound. So I'm going to go into why, and don't worry, I'll go in depth about Floor just as much as I did Tarja, but I do not want to be a part of that debate. You fans can argue about that all day. Keep me out of it. This is just some objective outside perspective, being that I'm not a Nightwish fan at all. So like I said, I know a little bit about Floor. I've done some research. I know that she was a voice teacher for a while, and I know that she's had some classical training, a little bit of a classical background with her singing. And upon a cursory watch of this video, I can kind of see some of those things kind of creep out in her sound and whatnot. So I'm going to go into that a little bit here. I hope you all enjoy this, and I hope that this maybe clears up some of the debate between Floor and Tarja. Maybe you can kind of juxtapose the two singing styles and get a better understanding of what each individual singer brings to the table. So here's Sleeping Sun. Here we go. So immediately, right off the bat, and I'm not going to do this by comparing her to Tarja. I'm going to say of her own merits and her own singing sound. Her approach to creating sound is not one of creating space necessarily. The way that she creates sound is just by having the larynx in a neutral position, having the mouth in a relatively neutral position. I don't hear any qualities in her sound that make me think that she's like really overly creating that like yawn gesture or setup that creates the openness in the back of the mouth. If I did compare her directly to Tarja, that was one hallmark of Tarja's sound, is that she always sung with a lot of space. But that's a hallmark of classical singing, and Floor here is clearly not trying to approach singing this in a classical way, just based upon the sound that she creates. And the way that you can sort of hear the difference for yourself is when you listen for the timbre of the sound. If the timbre of a sound is sounds sort of robust and open and full, typically that's because there's space in the mouth. And when it doesn't have that kind of thick, full sound, it's usually because there's less space in the back of the mouth. The vocal tract is smaller. So that's kind of what you're hearing here with Floor's case. One thing that Floor does for sure is that when she sings lines, she kind of lets some of the words sort of taper off a little bit. If you listen through, you don't hear a clear line or connectedness from word to word. So when you talk about concepts like legato singing or connectedness, that's definitely not what she's going for here. When you hear her sing words that sort of fade in and out, and there's like word space, word space, word space, she's letting the sound kind of come off of the voice and then bringing it back on with a little bit more air on the sound. But one of the things that actually makes this okay in her case is that she does have good support. And I know that every voice teacher ever talks about support like in some vague sort of terminology. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of explain this a little bit more for you so that you can sort of understand what I mean when I talk about that support. When you have breath support, the diaphragm is pushed down and the rib cage is expanded. And typically what breath support does for you is it allows your phrasing, it allows the notes that you sing to carry across a phrase or you don't have to be constantly taking breaths over and over again, even if your line or your phrasing doesn't last very long. And so one thing that you hear about her is that she's not taking breaths over and over and over again. So that tells me that she's got enough breath, she's got enough support underneath her, she's got enough structure and stability underneath her breathing mechanism to where she can kind of carry these phrases and allow for those little dips in her line and in her legato. And it's not the end of the world. I mean, this isn't bel canto, so it's not like I'm judging her based upon how connected her line is. That's not the standard by which she's singing, so it doesn't really matter that much in her case. So the bigger overarching point here is that if you have good support, you can sustainably sing even without having like crystal clear line or having or even breaking your phrase up. It's okay to do that. One of the biggest questions that I get asked by people is, well, what if someone wants to sing in a more rhythmic way and put more emphasis on words and they don't want to have this like legato, smooth and connected sound? That's completely your prerogative. And you can basically see a comparison with Tarja and Flor, where Tarja is all about that legato, that bel canto legato approach. But Flor is clearly using her phrasing and sort of breaking the words up a little more like this. And it's sort of a pacing thing. I think that she's doing it because she wants to sort of maybe accentuate words more. You can tell when a singer doesn't do it consciously, because what happens is they'll make pauses in the middle of phrases in awkward places, and then they'll take like these random breaths in places that don't make a lot of sense. And Flor's not doing that here. So it makes me think that she's got the support. She's just choosing not to have everything quite so connected together, which in rock and in metal I find all the time. So it's not like it's like some indictment on her or outside of the ordinary or the realm of what's acceptable in singing. I mean, so kind of look at it from that perspective. She's not trying to do the same thing in her singing that Tarja is, and that's a big thing to keep in mind throughout the course of this video.
I wish for this nighttime to last for a lifetime.
So when she sung the word last, you could hear her when she did the word last, she didn't go ah, she kind of did a lost. She kind of did more of an ah than an ah. That's a vowel modification, and so it makes a lot of sense in that point of the range. That's kind of the mid voice. I don't know for sure, but Flor sounds kind of like a mezzo soprano ish, especially singing those low lines that she was singing before this this particular point in the song. She sounds like a mezzo, but when she sung the word last, she took the bright ah and she kind of turned it into more of an ah, and that's completely normal and natural when you talk about like the mid voice for women. More neutral vowels is typically better at the mid voice, and it's actually the same for men as well. If you're in the mid voice, neutral vowels are going to be really easy for you. Like the hourglass figure that I've shown before demonstrates, when you move up for women, you want the vowels to be more open, and then when you get to lower pitches, you want them to be more closed, like smaller embouchures. So opening to an ah, like a more neutral ah, is completely fine on that vowel when you move up the voice. And she actually had a really nice sense of connectedness. If you listen to that ah on the word, or the whatever kind of vowel it was, something like that. When you listen to that word, you'll hear that it had a little bit of what we call spin on it, and a spin is sort of like that preparatory sound that ends up resulting in vibrato. There's a lot of like really colloquial terms that you kind of just have to learn what to listen for. But spin is when you hear that beginning of the vibrato sound. It almost like this sounds like the voice is spinning. Let me go back and play it again. Listen for the word last, and you'll hear that spin start to happen. So you could hear that sort of almost vibrato thing. That's what we call spin. And usually when you keep that supported and you hold that out, it ends up turning into a ringy, shiny sort of vibrato sound. So she's clearly got that capability. And it doesn't sound like a fake or manufactured vibrato or anything like that, or a forced vibrato. It sounds like it would be a natural vibrato. What I do find interesting is that she definitely created some more space in her sound when she moved up the voice a bit. So that leads me to believe that she's doing the same thing that a lot of pop singers or rock singers tend to do. When they're in the mid voice, they just let everything kind of stay neutral and just sort of do a sort of a talky sort of singing sound, which is fine. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If you're not going to be singing in a classical paradigm, I would much rather someone be using just sort of something very closely linked to their speaking voice in their singing, rather than trying to change the way that they sound into something else. So don't think that I'm saying something negative about her. I'm not at all. The biggest thing that I would give as a criticism of her up to this point is that there is a sense of inconsistency in her tone. And I'm not sure if it's because of a lack of connectedness in the phrasing, like I was talking about a while ago, or if it's just literally a physical thing where she's just not keeping her singing position all the time. I'm not 100% sure on which it is, but you do hear a lot of differences in her singing sound. Like when she sings into the low, it had a lot of like almost thickness. It almost sounded like masculine, for a lack of a better word. And then as she moved up the voice, that all kind of thinned out. But then when she got on that top note on the word last again, it kind of like opened up again. It's just it's not consistent. When I hear a singing voice, if I sung from the bottom of my voice, whatever, if I keep going up, I typically you want to hear like this consistent line of sound that doesn't really change. My voice would still be inherently distinctive because it's consistent all the way across the range, if that makes sense. And I don't hear that so much from her. And it's kind of a common thing in pop singers and rock singers in general, but especially in this case, there's definitely a very wide difference between the sounds that her voice creates across her range. It's not unhealthy. It's not like it's destructive to her voice, but it's something that if I were working with her, I would want to help her smooth out that consistency in her tone. So that was really, really nice. And we've talked about the concept of messa di voce before, which is like being able to take some of the volume off of the voice and keeping the tone consistent, which is funny because I was just talking about inconsistency in her tone. She did a really nice job there of moving up and taking sound off of the voice, but still keeping the breath to voice ratio there. Like she didn't put breathiness on her sound to make it softer. She actually kept the voice active and engaged, but just used dynamics and breath control and held a little air back to keep the sound more quiet. It's very good. And another thing to point out is that vocal melody she sung is the same one that she sung on the word last. So what she actually did is create a foil. The first time she sung the word last, she was open and it was a little bit bigger. When she sung the phrase this time on that high pitch, she kept it quieter. That's kind of a thing that you saw a lot in Italian arias where you'd have like these recapitulations of the same phrase or same melody, but the singer would be instructed to sing it in one method and then in a contrary method the next time, like big one time, then small the next time. She did that there. And so what she demonstrated is an awareness of that sort of singing concept where when you recapitulate a musical idea, you don't want to do the same thing twice back to back, because what happens when you do that is the audience hears redundancy. It's more interesting if you sing a line a certain way and then the second time you sing it, you vary it. It gives the melody a greater sense of completeness and it gives the audience multiple perspectives to hear that same melody from. So her musicality in that sense is excellent. I mean, that is like top tier, great stuff. I wish more singers did that kind of thing in music these days as a whole. So big props to her. I love it. Really good. So that vibrato on the word you, it kind of sounded like, I'm going to try to emulate it, but it was like you, it kind of sounded like that. When you hear that kind of vibrato, it's usually one of two things. It's deliberate pulses of air from the upper abdominals, like near the diaphragm, or it's a deliberate moving up and down of the larynx, like ooh, 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 kind of like that. Or if I do it from the diaphragm, ooh, kind of like that. That's what that sort of vibrato is. That was not what I would call a natural vibrato, which is I've described in videos prior, is when the folds like close fully, they oscillate. You know, they have this adduct and abduct phase where they move back and forth like this. And then when they close at the top end, there's an oscillation that happens when they fully close. And that's what creates the vibrato. And so that was not an example of an oscillatory vibrato. That was an example of like a forced vibrato. It's pretty minor and it's not egregious, and it's not like it's something that has happened throughout the course of the video, but I get a lot of questions about vibrato, and I thought that was a really good opportunity to sort of give an example of a vibrato that is being manufactured or forced.
From my God, it will depart. I'd sail before 1,000 moons.
Okay, so this is another thing I want to point out because I get this question a lot too. When she sung the word before, I know that she's not a native English speaker. The way that she approached the word before with her vowel is clearly an accent-based vowel. You can tell, and this is just something you're going to have to trust me on. I can't exactly quantify this in one singer's example. But there's a difference between a singer singing a vowel that they've learned throughout their accent or dialect and someone deliberately manufacturing a vowel in a way that doesn't sound like the base vowel. One thing that I find in a lot of Scandinavian countries, when the singers sing vowels that have an R sound, they'll really heavily lean on that R at the end of the phrase. And I think that actually happens a little bit later in the video. And if it does, I'll point it out. But it's very important to make the distinction between someone having an accent and that affecting the way the vowel sounds and someone deliberately changing the vowel to create a certain effect. Like there was, I think in my Mike Patton video, there was one point where he did this like ooh-ah kind of thing and the vowel was supposed to be ooh. That is not an accent thing. That's a deliberate widening of a vowel shape, as opposed to, in her case, when she did this vowel just a second ago, that was clearly an example of her accent coming in. I just wanted to point that out because I get that question a lot.
22 days of light will be desired by
Desired, that's a perfect example. The way that she sings desired, that's a very common approach to that R sound that I find in Scandinavian-based singers. So that is not an example of poor technique. That is an accent. There's a big, big difference. Big difference.
explain until there's nothing left to say.
So one thing that Floor does across the board that I really like is that she has an element of expressiveness in her singing. She does a very good job of carrying dynamic contours in her sound. Her singing very rarely sits in one place. Like, it's never super loud, never super quiet. If you listen back to Tarja's singing, this is kind of the bel canto classical approach. Like, it's like a joke. When you're in opera, you have two volumes, loud and louder. So, like, when you approach singing from that bel canto or classical perspective with that goal in mind to sing in that way, everything's going to be very big, like you're singing at the back of a room. You know, and that's why, you know, microphones are kind of irrelevant, because we just are taught to sing in concert hall settings anyway without them. But see, in Floor's case here, what she's doing is she's keeping everything dynamically very diverse. Like, she'll sing a phrase with a lot of volume. She'll sing a phrase with not much volume. And she's using the fact that she uses a microphone, and she's probably done a lot of training with a microphone as opposed to like without one kind of thing. And that allows her to sing in a more dynamically viable way in comparison with the music. Now, that doesn't mean that if you sing operatically or classical, you can't have dynamics. On the contrary, your dynamics are usually just as prevalent, but you kind of have a bass line that starts a little louder. Like piano in opera is probably like mezzo forte to someone like Floor, and then forte in opera is like fortissimo to someone like Floor. It's just kind of like that. The dynamic levels are all just kind of proportionally raised a little bit.
Time to lose for a lifetime. The darkness around me.
One thing that I kind of am iffy on about Floor singing is her embouchures. And I don't know if it's really affecting her singing sound that much. It's hard to tell. I'd need to hear how she sung it without these wide embouchures. But I'm seeing a lot of this like wide out, her lips are like going way out sideways. Typically, if you watch American football, you'll know what I'm talking about. I tell my students to keep it within the field goal posts, right? You don't want your embouchures to go out like lay sideways, because it just engages all these face muscles that don't need to be engaged. If you keep everything vertical and you just kind of keep all of your embouchures inside of the field goal posts, you can say everything you need to say and you can use every vowel and it makes no difference. Like, there's just no need to widen the embouchure out. The only time you might want to do that specifically is if you're trying to create a super bright, almost like shiny, smiley, happy kind of vowel. Like if I were talking like this, all of a sudden my sound takes on this very bright affect. So if you're trying to create that sound, then you might widen your embouchures out, but it's not something you want to sustain for a long time. I mean, if you try to sing with your cheeks out like that, it gets sore. I mean, it starts becoming physically difficult to do. You want to keep those embouchures nice and vertically aligned. Generally, when you're singing as a whole, if you're thinking about you're singing in a vertical fashion rather than a horizontal fashion, you're going to be in a good place, because vertical alignment, all it takes is your jaw dropping, and your jaw is hinged, right? So it just kind of pulls down. When you widen things outward, you're using your jaw still, but you're also engaging all this stuff that you don't need to. So that's something that I see about her that kind of makes me kind of go, that's something she could probably work on. A lot of pop singers, rock singers, metal singers are taught to sing that way. And I don't know if it's just because they want to create a certain sound or if it's because the teachers of this genre don't understand the ramifications of it. But in my view, and in my entire pedagogy and my whole health-based approach, don't use muscles when you don't have to. Because if you use muscles, then that is energy that gets expended that could be used elsewhere. And if you overuse muscles, then eventually those muscles will break down. So you don't want to put yourself in that situation. And doing the big wide embouchure once or twice is not going to be a cause for your vocal catastrophe. But it's the kind of thing that if you develop the habit of it and you constantly have these wide embouchures, it will eventually wear you down. You'll get tired a lot more easily. That's not something, your face muscles don't build up like your arm muscles do. It doesn't work that way. Just like the whole misconception that you work hard on your vocal cords and they get stronger because there's muscles. That's not how it works either. It's a very fragile mechanism. So anything that causes it to overwork is generally a no-no in my book. Same thing. She did the same foil there. Yeah, that's proof positive that it's a deliberate choice. The first time she sung that melodic phrase, she did a nice big open vowel on last, and then this second time she does the phrase, she kind of dials it back and even makes the line of the melody kind of go taper down a little bit. It's completely deliberate, and it shows a great sensitivity to the artistry that she's trying to convey. There's a big element of singing that I feel like is overlooked with modern singers. Singing is an art form. Make it artistic. Use your voice in artistic ways. I try to convey this all the time to people. Everything that you do can be considered an element of your art. Just singing notes is just singing notes. One thing that I learned about in college is text painting, the idea of text painting. Use the phrases, use the words themselves, use the contour of the dynamics, the contour of the singing line. How high does it go? How low does it go? All of those things collectively can help you better inflect the musical ideas you're trying to sing. And I feel like so much singing these days, it's like people talk about heavy metal being like super compressed. And I don't know a lot about production, but they talk about all the dynamics being like squashed together in the mix. Singers kind of do that too. They just kind of squash everything into like one or two like mid-range dynamic levels. And there's not a lot of diversity in the singing sound, but I hear that in Floor and it gives me hope. It makes me think like, wow, there are people actually here putting some artistry into their singing. I love that. And I would take that over a classically trained singer with perfect technique any day of the week. And trust me, I'm classically trained, so that's not a knock on what I do, but I would much rather hear some dynamicism with a little bit of flaw than perfect technique that's just static. But, in my view, great technique with the dynamicism is the best in my book. But and if I had to pick one of the two, give me something dynamic and give me something that's a little flawed with some dynamicism. So I'm really digging that. I think that there's some excellent stuff by Floor. Very tasteful, very musical. I love it. Very nice melisma. The da 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 da. That whole thing, that was a melisma. When you move multiple notes on one syllable, very good. And then she moved up and she had that ah. She kind of turned it into an ah vowel, which is a little wide again for my taste. Like that's my biggest knock on her is probably her embouchure usage. But other than that, like very nice melisma, very well connected, and it sounded pretty even. I think that she has a little bit of a propensity to put a little bit too much air through her sound sometimes. And when I talk about a little too much air, it's not because of the sound that it creates necessarily. It's just because when there's extra air, the folds just don't fully close. And we want chord closure. Like when you talk about vocal health, we want the chords to close. And I want all of you who watch this to sort of understand that as a baseline of where all of my analyses are coming from, it's all about getting that chord closure. Because when the chords don't close, the work gets distributed across the folds wrongly. And when that happens, the folds end up redistributing all the vibrations and all the things they're doing, but in places that wouldn't naturally want to do that because they don't fully close, right? So we want that full chord closure, and putting too much air through disrupts that a lot. So it's very important when you sing, if you're looking at vocal health, to make sure you're singing in a way with fully closed chords. And you can hear it by, if you listen to like kind of the sound within the sound of someone singing, you'll kind of hear this like kind of sound if they're using too much air over the top of their sound. Now, if you speak, you don't really hear that kind of wispy thing over the top of the sound. Now, you can speak quietly and it still won't have that airy quality to it. You can do that. You don't have to go like this to talk quietly. There's a big difference between the two. And when you speak or sing with that airy quality, you're deliberately keeping your folds from closing, which inevitably, without a doubt, in time will cause nodules. I mean, just ask John Mayer. He's had vocal issues and he does that with his singing voice all the time. So, you'd think that someone would learn after enough, vocal injuries or vocal issues, but some people just call that their sound and they say to heck with it when it comes to the damage it does to my voice. But I hope that all of you watching this and listening to me will take this into consideration, that there are other ways to make softer, more delicate sounds than having to go like this. You don't have to do that.
I wish for this nighttime to last for a life.
Okay, so here I'm interrupting the phrase because I want to go and point this out now. I think the key went up by a half step. It sounded like something like that. But immediately you lose some of that sense of nuance in her sound. It all of a sudden sounds very pushed. Even on her high notes, last, it doesn't have that openness anymore. It's like, it has that kind of quality to it. Instead of the word last having that last kind of sound, it kind of does la. It has that sort of pushed sound. And so hearing the distinction of the two sounds that she creates kind of reinforces the point I said earlier, that when she moves through her range, she has some inconsistencies in the way that she creates tones. There was no reason for her not to keep that openness up into this higher point of the range too, because it would be more reverberant, it would be more open sounding, it would be more robust sounding, it would be more colorful. Here, what I hear is strain, and she's opening her embouchures up even wider. So I'm hearing vocal strain, push here. And one of the number one causes of vocal issues in women specifically is carrying the chest voice up too high and pushing. Men really shouldn't be doing it either, but it's way more destructive with women because of the fact that when you move up in pitch, your vocal folds have to vibrate more and more and more and more and more the higher you go. So the more strain and the more push you're putting on your vocal cords, the faster you're making them vibrate in a more aggressive way. So that's even more of an argument that you want to kind of take some of the load off of the folds, redistribute some of that into a more open vocal tract, let the folds just lazily kind of vibrate. That's Pavarotti always called it lazy, like lazy singing. Let the vocal folds like lazily vibrate and let everything above it do all the work. And she's not doing that here. She's closing up her vocal tract, pushing the sound out really hard. This is the kind of singing that could potentially cause damage, especially in women.
Time, the darkness surrounds me, shores of shoulder sea.
So I kind of call this like the Shakira sound. If you ever listen to Shakira sing, she kind of does that, you kind of hear that thing in it. That is a byproduct of an almost completely closed vocal tract. Everything in here is just stuffed up in the throat. It is very bad for you. And it's like super common in like popular genres. Big girls especially do it all the time. And it's a style thing. So I think a lot of people are compelled to sing that way because it's popular and it's in style, it's in fashion, it's what people want. But if you look at the health ramifications of it, you are literally just saying all the sound's coming from down here, all the work's come from down here. And if the folds can't make the sound, all the muscles around it stiffen up and make it happen. It's just bad for you. Now, it doesn't mean that Floor sounds bad. She sounds great. Her pitches are fine. Everything's fine in that sense. I'm strictly talking about the physical machination, the physical mechanism that's happening to create the sound. So, there's a trade-off. I tell students all the time that Adele traded her voice for $100 million, right? More power to her if that's what she wants. But if you want to be a sustainable singer throughout your life, you can't make a career out of singing like this. It will cause vocal damage, without a doubt.
Oh, how I wish to go down.
And look at that. Just as I pointed out, look at all that tension that builds up on her face. I'm going to rewind it a little bit just so you can see it. Look at that. Like you can see all that forehead tension. All of a sudden, all the things that were so easy and effortless for her looks like she's having to use physical effort to make them happen. And that is a perfect visual example. You can almost even see the veins around her larynx, all this muscular stuff tensing up. You can almost see it clearly there. It's a perfect example of why when you stuff the vocal tract up, you don't let it expand, you don't create space, your body works in overdrive to create the sound. I've heard the argument that metal wants that push sound. I get that. I understand that. And if that's what you want to do, then do it. But you need to understand the ramifications. And this little snapshot is a perfect indicator of those specific ramifications. So that's it. And so, I know that I had a lot of good and bad to say, but I want to kind of summarize by saying I think that Floor is a terrific singer. I think she fits the genre perfectly. I would rather hear her sing this stuff than Tarja, I think, based upon the genre. Now, if I wanted to listen to some Puccini, I would definitely rather hear Tarja sing it. But in this style of music, I like what I hear from Floor much better. I just think that if she can demonstrate these technical things earlier in the song with the kind of efficacy and freedom that make these high notes sound resonant and full, I don't see why she doesn't move that into the end of the song when it would just convert over just as well. I don't really understand the reasoning behind it, but anything that causes more strain is usually a bad idea in terms of strict vocal health principles. So with that being said, I'm a big fan of this stuff. Hearing both the singers has been really interesting to me. It's nice to hear these different approaches to singing. I love Floor's sense of artistry. I pointed that out. I mean, I really like hearing that. So good stuff. Great singer. I hope that this comment section does not digress into some massive argument between the fans, but I do think that they are both completely valid singers in their own right. I think that this is more Floor's element, but I think that they are both completely great singers, and I really enjoyed this analysis for both of them. So next week is Christmas, so I will be taking the week off. No video from me. You may see a live stream at some point next week, so be on the lookout for it. And I have a couple of ideas of things to add to the channel coming into the new year that I'll probably start out then. But that's it. You guys know that I have a Patreon. Please feel free to subscribe if you want to support me. It helps out a lot. I do offer voice lessons, and I leave all my information in the description, in the comments. Please please subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you all again in the new year. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas to all of you. I'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye.